invitation. Let me also thank Ms. Azra Khan, Vice President of the Organizing Committee, for her invitation to this World Youth Summit for Peace. I think I cannot think of a better way to commemorate International Youth Day and acknowledge the critical importance of young change makers in building forward better our world, especially in these times of crises. Even though I'm a promoter of intergenerational dialogue, Excellencies and dear Ambassador, I would have loved to see more young thinkers and young change makers in this conference and summit today. I am absolutely a true believer in the transformative power of youth, and I believe that the involvement of youth not only makes international politics more inclusive and more democratic, but also brings innovation, creativity, and energy, which can, of course, strengthen and advance existing efforts to promote sustainable development and build more equal and peaceful societies. I would like here to quote the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres when he said that enabling the engagement of youth in formal political mechanisms does increase the fairness of political processes by reducing democratic deficits. It contributes to better and more sustainable policies, and also has symbolic importance that can further contribute to restore trust in public institutions, especially among youth. And end of quote. And I think that the words of the Secretary General are perhaps more important than ever, considering the disproportionate impacts that the COVID-19 crisis is having as we speak in young people. I think that we all agree that all economic sectors have been affected by the pandemic. Labor-intensive sectors such as, for example, wholesale and retail trade, accommodation, food services have been hit the hardest. We have to also remember that these sectors employ young people, both in the developing and the developed world, and young workers are the majority in these economic sectors. And as a consequence, according to the International Labour Organization, young people have suffered from greater levels of job loss and informality than adults because of the pandemic. And here are some numbers that speaks by themselves. While adults, the fall of employment registered 3.7% in 2020, the rate of youth employment dropped by 8.7% globally in 2020. And the numbers are higher, of course, in some countries in the global south. And of the almost 130 million young workers that exist worldwide, 3/4, 75% now work in the informal sector with lower pay, precarious working conditions, and limited or no access to social security services. So this is a scenario that is extremely challenging. And I think that as a result of all of that, about 17% of young workers live in poverty and 13% in extreme poverty. The rates of extreme working poverty and informal work status are especially high in the developing countries. And I think that one of the previous speakers mentioned the critical situation of sub-Saharan Africa, some areas of the Middle East and Southern Asia, and of course, my own region of Latin America and the Caribbean. So I think that if we take the big picture, and I agree with the former Prime Minister of Pakistan, that young and youth are diverse and they're not monolithic, but among young people, young women have been more likely to be unemployed than men. ILO figures also speak by themselves. Unemployment in young men, 11.2%. In young women, 13.9, almost 14% of young women are unemployed. So if we speak about the right to education for young people, school and university closures and mobility restrictions due to COVID-19 are affected the access of youth to formal education and training. And this, of course, in the long run, is going to have an impact in their insertion in the labor market. And here again, the digital gap between the rich and the poor, I think that the digital gap is worsening these situations by limiting access to education and training to people that are offline. And we have to remember that 50% of the world's population does not have access to internet. And this is absolutely critical also for young people. And to this bleak, I would say, landscape, we need to also add a situation of a trust deficit in public and democratic institutions. I think that the disproportionate impacts of the pandemic has had the most vulnerable social groups and young people, women, indigenous peoples, people of African descent, persons with disabilities, people living in poverty. Basically, this widening of the inequality gaps, of the transactional inequalities, it is basically deepening the existing and long-standing fracture inside and within countries. The crisis that we're living, that is, and we have to add, of course, the climate crisis, the extinction crisis, to the inequality crisis. We are seeing the rise of people, number of people in extreme poverty. Among them, a big number of them are from the younger generations. And we are speaking about 15 million people in extreme poverty in 2020. If the stimulus packages and the recovery efforts do not tackle the most vulnerable people, we are going to see an increase in extreme poverty. And the forecast is not very telling. It speaks about an increase from 115 to 150 million people only this year. And here, I also would like to echo the ones that have advocated for the imperative need of gender equality, especially the closing the gender inequality gap among young women. So, because even before the pandemic, women were more likely than men to live in extreme poverty, especially if we speak about indigenous women, women with disabilities. And of course, this has a tremendous impact in the younger generation. 47 million additional women and girls will be pushed into extreme poverty if we do not act now. And basically, when we speak about what needs to be done, what is an incredible paradox here is that we have the technology, we have the resources, we know what to do, and still we do not do it. There is a shortage in political will, in co-responsibility. I was saying paradoxically, because while large numbers of people worldwide are struggling against the effects of the pandemic, the richest men in the world have seen their fortunes increase. And I say men because for some reason, and we need to study this further, there are no women on the list of billionaires. So according to the Forbes magazine, the 10 richest men have seen their fortunes grown by $540 billion since the pandemic began. And this amount is enough to pay, we know, for a COVID-19 vaccine for everyone and to ensure that no one is impoverished by the pandemic. And here there are very interesting numbers of also coming from Oxfam regarding a temporary tax on excess profits from the 32 global corporations that have benefited the most during the pandemic. And these, we are speaking here about $104 billion only in 2020, if we were to back forward a little bit the situation. So I think that I was speaking about a trust deficit. According to the Edelman Trust Barometer, in 2020, governments worldwide enjoyed only a little below 50% of popular trust, meaning that 50% of the world's population do not trust their governments. And if we look at Latin America, it's scary. 8 out of 10 citizens do not trust political parties, and they do not trust their parliaments. And that, of course, includes a lot of young people that feel disappointed of what political leaders are doing to face this multiple crisis situation. So I think that the idea that politics is in charge of transforming reality for the good of society is being challenged by the current disconnection between politics and people, or in other words, by what we call privatizing economic gains and socializing economic losses. And for that, we need young people to transform politics, to be active, to engage, as former Prime Minister Yusuf Raza Gilani told us at the beginning. But, you know, in order to revert this situation, different world leaders are calling for the need for a new social contract. We need a new global pact, a new social contract with young thinkers, change makers at the center. Recovery efforts from the pandemic is providing, in spite of the losses, in spite of the fear of the future, of the insecurity unleashed by the COVID-19 pandemic, we are also provided with what I call a historical opportunity to build back better in every way, not only rebuilding our economies, but perhaps a more wise, comprehensive reconstruction that touches all institutional scaffolds, that strengthens through democratic systems, that promotes the inclusion of the voices and agency of all, of young leaders, of thinkers, scientists, of women. These new social contracts should contain, you know, rights and responsibilities and opportunities for everyone. Citizens must become actors. Although, of course, each society, each country has specific institutional conditions and political economic models, I am convinced that it is possible to reach common agreements that favor an inclusive and sustainable recovery. And for that, we truly need an intergenerational dialogue. We need to just get our act together in ensuring that access to basic public services such as education, health, housing, security, and social protection to all segments of society are guaranteed. The role, in my opinion, of multilateralism, of an inclusive democratic multilateral system should really take seriously the notion of the public and of the commons, which they need to be resignified, a new meaning and centrality in policy choices and investment, because efficient and well-equipped public institutions are central for the provision of public goods and for the protection of our commons. So I think that in conclusion, I strongly believe that the engagement of young people in shaping this new social contract and ensuring a greener, inclusive, and fairer recovery is crucial. I think that the agency and transformative power of young people in politics, in policy design, in advocacy is critical. Intergenerational co-building is what the world needs. and we should go beyond the tokenistic participation of young people. One has just to look at the voting behavior of youth in recent elections worldwide and find out that they express young people more environmentally and socially sustainable political positions. And in this sense, the future of collective action to address our most pressing challenges, such as I already mentioned, the climate crisis, the COVID pandemic, depends perhaps more than ever on the engagement of youth in political action. And a good example of that is the transformative power of youth that we saw in 2019. This was the year when youth movements worldwide pushed climate change into the headlines. They made it part of everyday conversation and turned it into a core agenda and item at the national and international levels. Fridays for Climate, I was a witness of that, and that had an enormous and political importance. So let me only conclude by reaffirming that we need to build upon the energy, the creativity, the motivation of youth and include them in political decision-making at the local, national, and international levels in order for us, humanity, to sign a new social contract to face the current multiple crises. And of course, build a more just, sustainable, and resilient world for the future generations. I think that for young change makers, a more sustainable and peaceful world is an issue, not only a moral imperative, but an issue of self-preservation. So happy Youth International Day. Thank you for this very enriching dialogue, and back to you, dear Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Excellency. I remember your address in the UN General Assembly while I was sitting over there. You made a history in the recent decades as a president of the United Nations General Assembly. Your motivation for